my normal lectures, I cover 5 large-scale scientific studies, of which fewer than 2% of the people in the audience have read any. This is the biggest one, Air Force Projects Special Report number 14. Came out in 1955, but it wasn't distributed. A press release was distributed. And the whole tone of the press release was just did this huge study. They didn't say who did the work, where the work was done, or even the title of the report. There's nothing of flying saucers, but soon we'll be building things that look like this drawing. If you see one, don't worry about it, it's ours. That was the tone. Here's what the Secretary of the Air Force said at the time. This got very wide distribution in October 1955. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. I feel certain that even the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been obtained. Secretary of the Air Force, mind. There's my University of Chicago classmate, Carl Sagan. He never bragged about my being his, so I can brag about this being mine. Here's what Carl said. The reliable cases are uninteresting, and the interesting cases are unreliable. Unfortunately, there are no cases that are both reliable and interesting. Sounds terribly profound. Must have studied a lot of evidence. Here's the data from Blue Book Special Report 14. You'll notice the only ones who are interested are the unidentifiable ones, the unknowns. 3%? No. 4, 5, 6? No. 21.5%. I think we can say the Secretary of the Air Force was lying. Second part, even those could have been explained if more observational data had been available. Well, here's this category. 9.3% were insufficient information. So he lied on both counts. Now, in terms of the reliability, same data, 3,201 sightings, they evaluated the reliability of the case. Of the excellent sightings, 35% were unknowns. Of the doubtful and poor, fewer than 18% were unknowns. Carl, you don't have it straight. The better the quality, the more likely to be unexplainable. These are facts, these are data. Never, ever discussed by the nasty, noisy negativists, as I call them. Or the naysaying newsmen. Or the ancient academics. They heap ridicule on the people who see things, who talk about them. It's time somebody point out that they don't know what they're talking about. As a matter of fact, the guys who did this study asked a very obvious question. All kinds of data on every sighting. They said, is there really any difference between the unknowns and the knowns? They looked at 6 different observables, apparent size, color, shape, speed, that sort of thing. Probability that the unknowns are just misknowns, less than 1%. So the notion that, if more data had been available, we'd have been able to identify them. But the only reason they can't be explained, not enough data. You've heard that Dr. Michael Shermer has said that on the radio and on television. He's the guy who played with the alien dolls when we were on Larry King. No, that wasn't Bill Nye the Science Guy. His purpose is to deny. That was a different program. We'll come back to him. This report is chock full of data, evidence, naturally ignored by the debunkers. Here's a symposium, House Committee on Science and Astronautics, July 29th, my birthday, 1968. I was born a little bit before that, same date anyway. Papers by 12 scientists, 6 in person, 6 more in writing. I was one of the latter group. I think I was the youngest of the group. The best by far was by Dr. James E. McDonald, a professor of physics. University of Arizona, talked to 500 witnesses, presented 41 of his best cases to Congress. Radar visual sightings, multiple witness cases, sightings over big cities, sightings by meteorologists, by pilots, by astronomers. You'd think scientists would pay attention to it. I mean, he's a member of the club, professor of physics at University of Arizona. Never gets discussed. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Now, you'd think the astronomers would always refer to J. Allen Hynek's book. After all, he was an astronomer, chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern University, Air Force scientific consultant for over 20 years. You look at their writings, they don't talk about Dr. Hynek. He studied the evidence. We can't have that. University of Colorado study, the so-called Condon Report. If you read the newspapers, January 1969, no evidence for flying saucers, no benefit to science from study of flying saucers. National Academy agrees wholeheartedly. Headlines across the country. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, world's largest group of space scientists, stood up a UFO subcommittee. Wouldn't let me on it. I'm a member of the AIA because I'd already made up my mind after 11 years of study. You'd think I would have. They did their study. They concluded one could come to the opposite conclusions from Dr. Collins based on the data in the report, and that any phenomena with 30% unknown, 30%, is certainly worthy of further scientific attention. You don't hear the debunkers talking about that. Science was wrong. Now here's their most famous, well, one of the two most famous New Hampshire cases. The incident at Exeter is one, as you all know. This is the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. Took place up the road a piece. Back in 1961, I'm sure you're all aware of the case. They saw a UFO, they lost 2 hours under hypnosis several years later, 2 years later. They related the story, each of them independently, of having been taken on board, examined, and put back out, till they wouldn't remember and didn't until this elaborate, sophisticated stuff was done by Dr. Benjamin Simon, one of the world's great authorities on breaking through for shell-shock war veterans, for people who've had traumatic experiences and can't remember them. He didn't know anything about flying saucers, but he sure knew how to help people. He ran a hospital that had 3,000 beds for such people after World War II. There's a star map on board that Betty observed, and Dr. Simon asked her if she could remember what it looked like. She said yes. He gives her a post-hypnotic suggestion. Please draw it later on, if you can remember it accurately. And she did, and it's in the book, the first book, Interrupted Journey by John Fuller. And the kicker is, what does it mean? Nobody knows. You got a bunch of points of light. There's supposedly heavy trade routes and light trade routes and occasional expeditions. You can imagine what Dr. Simon's thinking. Here he's got Betty Hill, a social worker active in the community, who's telling him this crazy story about trade routes and expeditions. Barney was on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission. Kathy Marden went with them by invitation to the inauguration of Lyndon Johnson when he became president. They were active in politics and affairs, very well respected in the community. And here's this crazy star map. Betty asked, "Where are you on the map?" And he said, "Do you know where you are?" "I don't know anything about astronomy." "Well, how can I tell you where I'm from if you don't know where you're at?" End of discussion. That's a weird sounding discussion when you think about it. A brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish built 26 different three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood. And there's a reason for showing you this, and this is to say, if you're going to say you can't get here from there, where's there? Some people will say, well, look how much energy it would take to get here from Andromeda. 2 million light years away. Who cares? How about our local neighborhood? The galaxy is 100,000 light years across, but within